Societally, something that we struggle with a lot is this lack of understanding leads to a lack of empathy and a lack of care. In the end, conversations about progression happen in rooms you are not present.
This is a very, very important, especially like you said, going into 2025.
And like, be who you are, do it in a way that's effective.
That is absolute gold.
It doesn't matter how great you are at your job. You can find yourself on the outside really, really quickly.
Okay, everyone, I am so excited today because we're going to have a very, very special person on the podcast today. I've been on her podcast as well, and it was very insightful. But Kendall Berg is the founder of That Career Coach. She helps her clients and her followers understand how to find progression, recognition, and support in their careers. And she is a fellow late diagnosed ADHD, which I didn't know until I went on the podcast. So, of course, I had to have her on. She's also been featured in Newsweek, Boss Babes, US News, and World Report and Business Insider, sharing her tips and advice. And side note, not only does she have a thriving coaching business, but she also works in the professional world full time. So we're definitely going to ask her about that, and the Director of IT Planning and Strategy. So welcome, Kendall.
Thanks, Sky. I'm so excited to be here and get to chat with you again. I just know it's going to be fabulous. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to get all the secrets today. I am excited for this. But let's start about talking about your ADHD, because we didn't really talk about that when we last spoke. So you mentioned that you received a late diagnosis. So take me through what that experience was like for you.
Yeah. So growing up, I used to joke all the time that I had OCD, weird little tics of like certain things having to be organized a certain way, or if I reached for a light switch and somebody else turned the light off, I would just like put it back on and take it back off. Or if someone interrupted me an hour later, I would still finish that thought as if I had never been interrupted, even though we had changed topics 15 times. So there were little kind of indications when I was growing up, but I was always like very hyper, highly organized and very focused on academic pursuits and then later career pursuits. And so as I got into adulthood, I met my husband, we got married. My husband also has ADHD, and but ours manifest in very different ways. And of course, when we were growing up, I felt like nobody really got diagnosed with it unless you had like literal stay in your seat difficulties, right? Like if you were a little boy who couldn't stay in his seat, maybe you got diagnosed in the late 80s, early 90s. But other than that, pretty much you were told like, just be better. So he was diagnosed young. I was not. We get into adulthood and I'm realizing that all these ways I respond to things seem to resonate really well with TikTok and all of these videos about ADHD and being slightly on the spectrum. So that led me into taking some online tests, which ultimately led to my diagnosis of ADHD, which explained a lot of how I approach situations and like certain almost tics that I had to keep myself on track. And then further solidified like my need for that organization, because without it, my ADHD is like everywhere. So I am like a very much all or nothing person. I'm either doing all the things hyper focused, hyper organized, or like a potato, and there's no in between. So getting that diagnosis for me just kind of made sense, like why I operated that way, as opposed to me feeling like, oh, it's just like how Kendall is. It had more solidity around it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And also like, I think we're probably very similar in that way, which is why I'm going to ask you, how many times have you burned out?
So what's interesting for me is I moved a lot growing up. So I've moved 38 times, right?
Wow.
So a lot.
Wow. That is a lot. Yeah.
And as a result of those experiences when I was young, I think I built up a really high stress threshold. So I like firmly believe people have different stress thresholds. What burns one person out does not necessarily equate to somebody else.
Yeah, definitely.
And because of that, there's only really ever been one time in my career where I was like, I'm out. I took 2 weeks off for mental health and kind of disconnected, came back to work, and then realized like, nope, those 2 weeks were not enough. But I think because of that stress threshold, I haven't burned out as much as I probably could have, given the amount of things that I like to take on my plate at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, and we're going to get into some of those things, but I am curious, so you were diagnosed when you found out, what did that change for you in terms of how you showed up in the workplace, or, what supports you received?
I think for me, I had really accidentally kind of created some artificial systems to keep me on
Mm,
track. I think when you struggle with ADHD, it manifests in each of us a little bit differently. I have friends
mhm,
where it's really debilitating and leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress.
mhm,
For me, because of that high stress threshold, the anxiety is not as much of a struggle for me, but the
mhm.
focus and the momentum almost is a big
Yeah.
place where I have to create artificial systems. So
Mhm,
I would say when I found out, it more solidified the reason behind the things I was already doing as opposed to changing
mhm.
the way I was doing them. But what it did change was it gave me a lot more empathy for people around me who were struggling in different ways.
Mm, mm,
So
mm.
I manage a team. Everybody has to be managed differently. I think that's true of every case. It's the same as being a teacher. Not everybody learns the same way. So you got to
Yeah.
coach different ways. But I have some people on my team who have extreme anxiety who may text me at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday and be like, I'm done for the day. Brain can't take it anymore. See you tomorrow. And I
Mhm,
have other people who get easily distracted and have that
mhm,
ADHD component of like, ooh, squirrel, that
mhm,
now I have a lot more empathy and a lot
mhm.
better tools for helping them. I think
Yeah.
as opposed to before I was diagnosed when I was more like, well, just like be better, just like
Yeah.
do the thing. And I think that's like societally something that we struggle with a lot is this lack
Mhm,
of understanding
mhm.
leads to a lack of empathy and a lack of care.
Yeah.
So I do think it's changed in that way for me. But I wouldn't say for my personal behavior, it didn't change how I showed up so much as it just reinforced like, this makes sense why I do it this way and
Yeah.
why that works for me, as
Mhm.
opposed to needing to create new systems to support
Yeah.
that.
Well, that's good. I think it shows, first of all, a bit of a flexibility in your role, but also a certain capacity to trust yourself. Because a lot of times when I work with people and they come from a late diagnosis, the issue isn't that they don't have a sense of what would work for them. The issue is that they resisted it because they felt like, oh, you know, but I can't do that because I was told that that wasn't how you do it. So I've been forcing myself to do it a different way. And that
Mm.
can be a big factor sometimes.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to use technology as an example. I love
Mm-hmm.
technology. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
great. Chat GPT scares the shiz out of me, but other than that, I think it's like a fabulous thing. But I have to have a physical notebook. Like
Mm-hmm.
I know this about myself.
Mm-hmm.
Typing it in a to-do list, putting it on my calendar, like those
Interesting.
things don't help me. I have to have that physical medium. So only recently have I moved to like a remarkable tablet, which is like it doesn't
Yeah.
have apps, it doesn't have tech. It's literally just like paper, but then I don't have
Yep.
to throw a bunch of paper away, but I have to write it down. I have to
Mm-hmm.
physically write it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it like somehow bypasses short term memory to my long term memory. And it's less likely I
Mm-hmm.
forget it. And
Mm-hmm.
I will even put notes to myself like, put car keys in the fridge, even though I know it makes no sense, but I'll be like, that way I remember car keys are in the fridge. I don't know that I've done that aside from when I was pregnant, just for the record, but I will leave even notes like that to
Yeah.
myself of like,
Mhm.
hey, next Tuesday, remember this thing
Yeah.
is going to happen and you're going to need to do this because
Yeah.
otherwise nothing. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that's a great, like what works for everybody doesn't, or everybody,
Mhm.
the neurotypical population
Yeah.
doesn't always work. And for me, like one of those big things is like the paper fixation. Like I have to have that. And so I can totally see how people would be like, oh, but my boss said just put it in Outlook or just put it in
Yeah.
this tracker or just put it in this list. And then it
Or
never happens.
sometimes even I have a lot of people who are, really empathetic about the environment, which I completely understand and respect. And they're saying, like, I'm trying to go paperless and everyone else seems to be able to do it. And I'm not able to do it. And so obviously they're remarkable. I have a remarkable too. Love my remarkable. Solves that problem for those of us who need paper. I'm very much the same when it comes to writing and things like that. But it is one of those issues that I think it comes up. The other one is that sometimes people will overcomplicate their systems. The other one
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot is when people come and they say, well, I figured out that if I have 3 different apps and I spend all Sunday organizing them and then I throw some salt over my shoulder, then I think we have a good week.
I love it.
So yeah, definitely. Okay, so in terms of then your career, I really want to get into this because we talked about ADHD in the workplace, the corporate game, how ADHD shows up in the workplace. So Can you tell me, like, if you are an employee and you are wanting to share your ADHD, and I want to know your own experience, first of all, like, what was your experience? Did you ever share your ADHD?
So my current boss knows. He was also the first boss that I had after my diagnosis, where I started
Yeah.
like a new job and had a new start.
Yeah.
And I have a wonderful boss. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess the caveat that I would add to this is I'm also realistic that lots of people don't have wonderful bosses. So like your experience will vary greatly depending on the environment of your company culture, the relationship you have with your boss's personality type. But my boss is very like, great, what do you need from me? Like, does that
Yeah.
change anything
Love
about your
that.
working styles or anything different you need from me from a communication perspective? And I'll give an example. Like I said, I adore my boss, but he is the king of like the high teams message. My whole team is like, oh my God, I hate when he does that. What does that mean? Are we getting fired? Do we have a new project? Has something
Oh God.
exploded? Like it
Yeah.
could be
Yeah.
anything. And it
Yeah.
starts with like, hi. It's like this very ominous message. And that was one of the things that we talked about was like, hey, if you're going to high ping me, can you make sure that like I'm not read in a meeting when you do that? Because otherwise I'm not going to be able to focus on the meeting that's happening. I'm going to
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
like focus on the high thing until I get that resolved. Otherwise my brain's
Yeah.
going to like absolutely lose it. So he was really great. Like, what do you need from me? How do I
Yeah.
support you? Again, he's used to some of my systems because that's how I organize myself. Therefore, that's how I organize my team and my thoughts to him. But I know that won't be exactly the same experience for everybody else.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point, and it's wonderful when you get that support. I recently had to instill I give everyone 1 week's notice for any changes that I decide to make because
Love that.
people were like, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep being like, we're going in this direction now. We're doing this. And I was like, oh, I guess that does count as change. Right. Yeah. Oops. Sorry. So it is, it does come up. Hey, you listening to this podcast. If you like what we do and you want to hear more of it, there is one way to make sure that that happens. Please go ahead, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. We have been told 5-star reviews can help us to get seen by more people, which means more people are going to learn about ADHD strategies.
Just press the button. Just give us a 5-star review.
One of the questions I get a lot, which I'm happy to have you here to answer, is like, when did you tell your boss and when would you recommend telling somebody that you have ADHD?
I think some of this is going to come down to a few things that I'll touch on. So one, like I mentioned, is kind of your relationship with your boss. If you have a toxic a-hole boss, which we're just not going to pretend does not happen, it totally happens. Maybe that's not who we try with. Like maybe that's not the person that we pick to like launch these new systems with and like try to create a good relationship. Maybe you find a good mentor within your company instead, who you really respect, who you have a good relationship with, and you tell them first. And you say, hey, how could some of my systems work into the way that the company works? Or this is something I found works for me. Do you think that's something my boss would be open to? Like if your boss is not a great boss or even a good boss, maybe find somebody else in your company to like soft launch that announcement with, because for a lot of people, this is still a source of like a stigma, or they feel afraid to share that part of them. And so hard launching with an a-hole toxic boss is like not the best starting point for you personally as an individual. So I would say if you're in that situation, find somebody else who's really supportive, who's a peer, who's a mentor, who's another leader in your organization, maybe somebody else who's come out with it, and like start with them and figure out like how you want to go through it, almost as a dry run before we try with the bad boss. So that's like my first piece of advice is a little bit of read the people around you, read the room. It's not going to be fun for you if you're coming out the gate with somebody who you know is going to respond badly. So that's kind of the first piece. The second piece is when you communicate and I think this is broader than ADHD, any type of mental health, anything, it is important to know what those people can do for you and what you are going to be doing that they need to be aware of when you communicate it. So this is where it needs to be somewhat of a tactical conversation, because where I think people struggle is, hey, I'm struggling with ADHD. This is showing up in my work and I wanted you to be aware. And your boss goes, if they're good, they're like, hey, great. What do you need from me? And we go,
yes.
this. I just
Yeah.
needed you to know and I'm done. And that's not
Yeah.
as helpful, right? So
Yeah.
I would say, even before you have that conversation, what are like 2 or 3 things you want them to know that would help you? So
Yep.
maybe it's not the obscure high Teams message, right? Maybe it's not scheduling last minute meetings on your calendar. Maybe it's that your preferred method of communication is email. Maybe it's that you only do, like, I'm a big fan of day blocking, which I'm sure we'll get to later in the episode at some point, but like maybe it's that you day block. And so it's easier for you to do certain tasks, certain times of the week or certain times of the day. But like, what are things they need to know that they can help you with?
Yeah.
And then what are some systems you're going to put in place that they need to know, which is like, hey, I'm only responding to emails first thing in the morning and then early afternoon. If you need something other than that, please Teams me so that I know that it's urgent. Or like, hey, I'm going to take, instead of taking big chunks of PTO off, I'm going to take random Wednesdays because that allows me to like reset midweek, which I'm going to need, right? So figure out what kind of things you're going to do so that when you go into this conversation, one, you have an audience that cares and is receptive, especially the first time we're talking about this. But two, we're empowering them with how they help you. And you may not know, you may not have it all figured out. There may be things that change, but even if it's, hey, here's one thing I know would be really helpful. As I'm figuring this out, I'm sure I'll bring you more things. I'd love to touch base on this once a quarter if you're okay with that.
Yeah.
Something that adds some structure, because most people do not like to feel incapable. And when we give them a lot of information and there's nothing they can do with it, they get frustrated. And I don't want that to be anybody's experience.
And that's actually where sometimes people will come to us, because they'll find themselves in a position where they're like, so I told them that I had ADHD and then they asked me what I wanted and I said I didn't know. You know, that's kind of something that can happen. And just to kind of add to that, I would also say, if you do have that toxic a-hole boss, you can always try the, you know, this is how I work the best. Tie it to the vision, right? You have this vision. I want to support you in this vision. I work better if we do it this way in this vision. You don't always have to say why.
Yep, absolutely true. It is your personal information. You don't have to disclose it.
Yeah.
And that's why I think being somewhat tactical with it is the most helpful approach, especially in corporate.
Yeah.
I would love to say that like corporate is this warm, fuzzy place where everybody wants everybody to be successful. But life has taught me that that is not the case. And so if you give somebody something they can work with, you're more likely to get a positive response. And I love your comment of tying it to the vision. Like, hey, you mentioned one of the goals for me this year is to be more organized and have better attention to detail. The best way I do that is this, because that is going to create action for them and follow through for you.
Exactly. Tying it to the vision is like the number one thing of working with people, whether you're the employee or the employer or whatever you're at, you want to keep tying it to that vision that people have, because everyone has one and you just got to figure out what it is. Even if it's more time on the couch watching TV, chilling out. That's a vision. That's a vision that people have for their lives. Okay. So let's say this person we're talking about, they want a promotion. You know, they want to show up as ADHD because they want to be able to, you know, bring their strengths and their weaknesses and all that kind of stuff, but they also want to get a promotion. Let's talk tactical, because I work with, you know, I talk to a lot of professionals and we talk tactical all the time. Like you said, it is strategic. How do you position yourself for a promotion when you have ADHD?
So some of this is going to come down to understanding how you work best, right? Sky, you know as well as I do that like coaching is a bit of a niche skill where like what works for one does not always work for all.
Yep.
But what I would say generally is, in the end, getting promoted comes down to proving to your boss that you are more valuable to them at the next level than you are valuable to them at your current level. In the end, that's what we're trying to accomplish. I think a lot of people have this preconceived notion that a promotion just means like, oh, I'm really good at my job and now they're going to pay me more to do that same job. Wrong. In some fields, at some junior levels, that is the case where like you get more technically proficient and that just allows you to get to that next level. But generally, if I'm getting promoted from, let's say, a senior associate of basically anything to a manager, what's the value they get in paying me a manager salary, calling me a manager title, giving me more influence? What do they get for that? They get scale, because now I can build a team who operates like me under me. They get more deliverables because I can deliver more work with more people. they get clarity of vision because I know what I'm going to do as a manager, et cetera, right? So when it comes to positioning for your promotion, regardless of whether you have ADHD or not, a lot of it comes down to what value do they get from you at the next level that they didn't get from you at the current level. So when you do have ADHD, and you mentioned it earlier, we can like, pivot. I'm going to do this because some executive mentioned it in a meeting that was really, really important. And I can go do that. And then that executive is going to be impressed. I'm going to get promoted. We all have this tendency to like squirrel. And you'll notice if you have ADHD that many executives do. If strategies and roadmaps are anything to go off of, because like Tuesday, all we care about is automation. And by Friday, it's AI. Like who knows what they're going to want next.
Things happen, okay?
Exactly. So it's not just you, first off, but if you have ADHD, you're trying to position yourself for a promotion. My best advice to you is create a clear strategy that gives you the flexibility to do it the way you want to do it. So I'll give you a clear example. The division that I run is execution strategy, which is a very nebulous concept, but essentially we make sure that my company has the people they need, the money they need, the resources they need, and the direction that they need to get the stuff done they want to get done. So when I think of a strategy for my team, it's not saying like the company strategy is our strategy. My strategy is automation and scale. That is very vague. But at the same time, if you asked anybody who works for me, what's our priority for 2025, they would say automation and scale, or they better, or they have not been listening. But that gives me the flexibility where if I want to build a dashboard tool that's going to solve this problem, the executive mentioned on Tuesday, that's automation and scale. But if I want to automate a workflow process so that people can get their work done faster, that's also automation and scale. So it is a theme. It is a direction, it is a strategy. It gives my whole team marching orders, gives my leadership clarity of what my priority is, but it has enough flexibility that if I have shower thoughts at 2 a.m. and decide no, I've decided we need a bot that's going to do this, it's okay because it fits into that strategy and I can sell it back to my leadership and my team that it's still tied to what I'm going to do. So if you're going for a promotion, the mistake I see people make a lot, especially if you have ADHD, is we create these really, really niche goals. I'm going to deliver this medicinal increase for a biochemical product and it's going to do this. And like, this is our goal. And it's very narrow. And something happens in April and our executive team changes their mind and they decide to go a different direction and we lose our funding and we're stuck because we did the thing we said we were going to do. We did the thing our boss agreed was going to get us promoted and nobody cares and there's no promotion. So I would structure, like, especially as we're about to go into 2025, I always structure 5 goals for my individuals. 2 are like technical BAU. This is what it takes to get my job done and feel good about it. 2 are these strategy goals. They're more vague, but they give me the flexibility to kind of operate in that space effectively. And then 1 learning goal, soft skill, technical skill, something that I'm going to learn, develop, grow in over the next year. And then the last piece of this is then talk about it with your boss. Don't expect your boss to be a mind reader because you're like, I've decided I'm getting promoted. I did the things Kendall said. I built this great strategy. I have these projects that align with it. I know it's important to the company. Where's my promo? And your boss is like, what are we talking about?
I didn't know. I've shoulder tapped somebody else that has been knocking on my door every day. Like, that's the thing. If you don't, they will. Like,
exactly. And so have that conversation with your boss. Hey, here's the goals I want for myself. Here's the direction I think I'm taking myself, my team. Does this align with A, your priorities and your vision? And B, do you think this is sufficient to showcase the value I could add at the next level to get me promoted? If you do those 3 things, then ideally you'll have enough flexibility to do it your way, with your structure, with your changing perspective, but enough clarity to at the end of the year walk into your boss's office and be like, hey, remember when we talked about that promo? Here's the things I did. Here's what I'm going to do next year if I get promoted. What's the plan?
That is absolute gold. So for anybody who hasn't already, clip this, share this. This is a very, very important, especially like you said, going into 2025. And I think you're 100% right, and actually, side note, that's one of the reasons our organization is called Unconventional Organization, because I was like, I'm pretty sure this is always going to be relevant. in terms of like the vision is an unconventional organization. But yeah, in terms of how you get there, it does, these things shift. And also just like if you tell your boss that you're looking for a promotion, then they will think of you as somebody who's looking for a promotion, and they will associate the things you do with things that somebody looking for promotion does, and they might give you more responsibility. Sometimes, I'm talking more from that boss level here. We can be scared to give responsibility to somebody because there are a lot of people who are like, I do not want a promotion this year. I do not want to do anything except my job this year. And we want to be supportive of that as well. So it's good to know who wants to grow.
And I think sometimes there could be gaps in an individual's performance that we don't necessarily share unless they're trying to prep for the next level.
100%. Yeah.
I'll give an example. There's an individual on my team, fabulous, super high performer, wonderful, wants to get to the next level and mentioned it to me for the first time like 3 weeks ago. And I was like, okay, so I need you to talk more. And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, you're on all these meetings and you do great work and you're clearly listening and you execute and you're fabulous, but you don't talk enough. So that next level is a lot of FaceTime. I need to see you FaceTiming to make sure you have that skill set before I put you in this role where it's going to be like dropping you in the deep end of a pool and you're going to be FaceTiming all the time. And he was like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. I could do that. I just always figure I can be quiet because you're on the call. And I'm like, I get that. This is not a negative thing in your current role, but it is a skill you need to display for the next level role.
Yeah.
And so that also opens up your boss the opportunity to be like, hey, if you want to get to the next role, here's the thing that I'd love to see you do more and give you that opportunity. Some bosses still don't do that for whatever reason, which is like we have a whole separate episode on how managers should manage. But
there's another episode on the opposite in the works, I'm sure.
Like, come on, bosses, you can do this. But I totally agree with you as a boss. Sometimes we need to see that initiative to know what to invest in you or to know how to push you or to know how to encourage you towards that next level as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And I would just say for those of you who are thinking about it and you're like, oh, but I bet so-and-so is going for the job and they're just do it anyway. Yes. Just do it anyway.
I have seen 2 peers get promoted at the same time because they both went for it and they were both fabulous and they both decided they got it. I have seen 2 people go for it and the underdog get it.
Yep.
And I have seen them both go for it and the person who you thought was going to get it gets it, but now you're on the radar and you get stolen 6 months later to go on some other team and do the same job. So it is always in your best interest to express what is in your best interest and then take in the information and decide what to do with it. But this is a quick side note, but I'm going to say it because now I'm on this track and it's one of my biggest pet peeves. So many people do not say what they want because they have this fear of failure or a fear of rejection. But the reality is if you never ask, then you don't have enough information to decide if you're in the right spot.
Yeah.
So if I ask for promotion and my boss goes, hey, you're 3 to 5 years out from that, and in my head, I'm already there, then this is not the right spot and the right trajectory for me. And I need to look at other teams internally or other companies externally. But until I have that information, I can't make the best decision for myself.
Yeah. And it can be so hard. Rejection sensitivity is huge with ADHD. And in terms of how to handle that, what I would say is have a plan. And this is true whenever you're doing anything. Like you need to go in knowing what you're going to say and doing it at a time of day where if you fall apart afterwards, that's okay. We've all been there. I'm going to go home. I'm going to get some ice cream. I'm going to see my dog. Like whatever it is for you, just make that plan. And then if it's amazing, then you're having the best ice cream ever. And if it's not amazing, then you're still having ice cream. So just like make sure that there's a plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And that you know what you're going to do with the information you get. Because I find a lot of times for me, especially, I mean, I have a huge fear of rejection, don't get me wrong. But if I know what I'm going to do with that rejection, it's much more palatable for me. Yep. If I say, hey, I'm going to ask my boss about this promotion. And if he says no, I know that means I need to look for a new job. Then at least I have action steps of like, he said no, great. I eat my ice cream. I apply for some jobs at the same time, like on to the next thing.
We're on LinkedIn.
Exactly. And so sometimes it's just knowing like almost a decision tree. Like he says, no, here's what I do. He says, yes, here's what I do. And like that will allow you also to digest the information in a more actionable way rather than getting stuck. And it's not the purpose of today's podcast, but I compete in pageants. Well, I have competed in 2 pageants, which I had never
Oh.
done until I was in my 30s. I think it has this weird stigma
Yeah.
around it. People don't really do it. And I have done it twice. I have lost twice. I was 5th place one year and runner up the second year.
Wow.
And I had a plan both times of like, okay, here's what we do with this. Like,
Yeah.
here's the next steps. Here's the plan. Here's how we prep. Because otherwise that failure would have like cut me off at the knees and made me miserable.
100%. Yeah.
And so you have to have that like, okay, if it goes my way, here's what yes looks like. And if
Yeah.
it doesn't, here's what I'm doing next.
Yeah.
So that you can have, for me, it's a couple drinks at the bar, probably an espresso martini, and then it's a nap.
Yeah.
And then we're at it. So I love that advice. Like, plan for what you're going to do after, and then make sure you know where you're going after that.
Exactly. I love that. And just side note, do you have a pageant coach?
I do.
Sorry, I don't. America. I'm in New Zealand. Most of my clients are in America. I just know about pageants randomly. One of those hyper focuses I had once, and
Love
I was
it.
like, oh, it's so interesting, and like it's so alien to like this culture that I'm in. So I just find it very fascinating. Anyway, that's very
It's
cool.
so fun. No, but it was a hyperfixation of mine. Of I was like, I had moved states. I wanted to get more involved in my community, and I wanted to meet people. And meeting people when you're an adult is hard.
Yeah.
And I work full-time remote, so it's not like I'm meeting people at work. And I love my husband, but he cannot stand me talking to him 12 hours a day. He needs other outlets, and so do I. And so one of my friends I volunteered with at a nonprofit was like, you should do a pageant. You would love it. And I was like, ew, who does pageants? That's like weird. And then a friend of mine on social media messaged me and was like, hey, have you ever thought about doing a pageant? I feel like you'd really love it. And I was like, that's weird. That's like 2 people in 1 week.
Yeah.
And then 2 days later, somebody else texted me and was like, hey, so I was talking to a friend of mine who does pageants. I feel like you'd like it. And I was like, okay. So then
Okay, universe.
ADHD style, I'm like watching every pageant video that's ever been posted on YouTube. And I'm like down the rabbit hole. And I have a coach like 3 days later, and I'm prepping. And so it was like a hyperfixation thing for me. I always have a hobby that's my like full brain focus when I'm not at work, just to keep myself balanced.
It's a great idea.
Which is just another tip if you have ADHD, is like have
yeah.
something outside of work.
Yeah.
Because otherwise work starts to define you.
And when I work with people who have like what I would call high pressure jobs, which you would definitely be in the category for, I often get them to get a high pressure hobby. Like it's not enough to go home. Like it really depends on who you are, but I have a lot of clients who they need to go, like they need to do things. So it's like, okay, I'm not going to like sit down and like crochet, although crochet is amazing. You can't turn the dial down that fast. So having something like pageant where there's like a thing and it's pressure and it allows you to just switch your topic without switching your energy from a dopamine level. It's quite an easy switch there.
I love this. This makes so much sense in my life, Sky, because I want to be the mom who like knits and colors. I am not. And so this makes so much sense because I totally agree with you. Like I always have a high pressure, whether it's like exercise or pageantry or something that's like more of that high energy piece. So I love that. Yes, that's awesome.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. So, and what I would say for you is to, if you need to, because, sometimes our doctors and people want us to chill. So, if you ever do need to, then I would say switching into pageants and then turning that into watching pageant videos and then turning that into turning down the dial rather than just switching, because it's hard to do with ADHD.
Makes perfect sense. See, love this.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the other side, because I'm sure there's a bunch of people being like, okay, yeah, promotions, whatever. But I, whoever they are, am on a performance plan or about to be, or I'm getting the looks, I'm getting the conversations. Like, how do I take myself all the way from that place? Because I get a lot of people coming to me saying, hey, I'm on a performance review and I need help. What is your recommendation in those circumstances?
A lot of this comes down to lack of clarity of expectations. So again, we could have a whole separate episode on why those bosses let that get to that point without there being clarity. But what I would say is when we get on a performance plan or we're close to a performance plan or something is going sideways, a lot of the time, especially if we're not neurotypical, we don't always understand why, because the words that our boss is speaking are not correlating to what we think we're doing. So I tell all my clients, like we all have expectations of ourselves. and we project those expectations on other people, but we never tell them. Everybody does this in the whole world. I do an expectation setting exercise with every single client. I've done thousands of them. Nobody's 5 have ever been the same, ever, in the thousands I've done. So your boss has some set of unspoken expectations for you that we're not getting, that's leading to this performance plan, this performance improvement need, but we're not getting from them what we want to know how to fix it. And so the first step is that we have to understand what it is they're looking for that they're not getting. And a lot of people, regardless of ADHD, we struggle with really asking those tough questions because it's an uncomfortable conversation. So if we're on a performance plan and they say, well, you're trying to pick a vague one, a lot of people get like communication. You need to work on your communication. You're being put on a performance plan. Communication is so vague and not helpful at all, because I don't know what to do with that. Is it written? Is it verbal? Is it body language? Is it the way that my eyes move when I talk? Is it the fact that I have RBF when I'm not talking? Like, what is it exactly? So we need to say, hey, I really appreciate this feedback. Everybody wants to get defensive. Don't get defensive. It doesn't fix the situation. Hey, I really appreciate this feedback. When you say communication, can you give me a specific example? What is a specific example where my communication was not how you expected it to be? And if they say, well, if I can't think of one, you say, great. The next time we're in a meeting, can you ping me live in the meeting and say, hey, this part of your communication is where I'm struggling, or this part of your communication is good. I'd like real-time feedback so that I can hone in on what the problem is. Because sometimes bosses don't really know how to say it either.
Yeah. They're like, just this vague.
Yeah, just like you. And you're like, thank you. And I've shared this on my podcast a lot. I had a boss early on in my career. He's fabulous. He got a special shout out in my book, in fact, because he was not my boss at the time, but we'd worked together a long time. And he was like, everybody wants you on their team because you get so much done. No one likes you. And you need to fix that. And this is this guy I have so much respect for. We've worked for years. And I remember at the time thinking like, what do you mean? I'm so nice.
Yeah.
And it took years for me to hone in on what he meant by that. But it was the biggest life changer in my career, was like the way I was communicating things. It wasn't what I was communicating. It was the way I was communicating things was not landing the way that I intended. And it was causing this communication disconnect. So ask for specific examples. What are you doing? If they don't have them off the top of your head, ask for them to message you real time in meetings. It is kind of distracting when you have ADHD to have the pings going off, but like it will help you long run.
It should be on mute.
It should be on mute. But like, hey, ping me real time. And then when you see someone who has good communication, what does that look like to you? Have them articulate their expectations, because sometimes it's hard to say what somebody's doing wrong, but it's easier to say what somebody's doing right. So like, who on the team would you say has great communication? What would be an example of having great communication? What are some of the skills they have that make them a great communicator? Hone in on those, because once we know with clarity what the problem is, we can start to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second thing is, don't bite off more than you can chew. ADHDers especially, we're like, I can do all the things. Look, I'm climbing the Eiffel Tower while baking a cake, while running a half marathon, knitting a hat. Like, we do all the things and then we do nothing. And all of those are half finished, but that's a separate conversation. Pick 1 or 2 things max, just general rules. Psychologically, never go over 3 for anything. Never go over 3 points, never go over 3 topics you're working on, never go over 3 hobbies. It's just a psychological barrier where your brain starts to process less efficiently once you're trying to do 4 or more. Side note. So no more than 3, ideally 1 or 2 skills that you're working on. Clarity of what the problem is. Get good expectations and good examples of what it looks like to do it right.
Good examples, yeah.
And then create a measurable way to do those things. That is it.
Yeah.
Anything above and beyond that, you're going to overwhelm. You're going to get distracted. You're going to have a hard time. Yeah. And so I tell leaders, if you're a boss listening to this and you're like, well, I have somebody on my team who needs to be on a PIP and I don't know how to do it. You need to start to give thematic feedback. So this is the flip side. Most bosses, we give very narrow feedback. So we're like, hey, on this meeting, you were annoying and I didn't like the sound of your voice. And then the next meeting, we're like, hey, you didn't set up this call very well. I need you to intro it better. And then the next meeting, we're like, hey, your slides didn't make sense. They needed to be a different order. We give these like pinpoint feedback. When thematically, I need you to work on your meeting presentation skills.
Yeah.
That is a theme that is actionable. And then I can tie that feedback to it. Hey, when I when you were in that meeting, remember we talked about setting up like your meeting cadence a little more effectively? I noticed that your slides could have been in a more efficient order. I want you to start working on that. We can do dry runs before your next meeting. So if you're a boss giving feedback, the mistake I see is we give them tons of little things, but we don't tell them what's wrong.
Yeah.
So give a theme, then give them specific examples within that theme, give them how they make it better, and then measure them on that. It's the same way that you're going to get out of a PIP is how you should be delivering one. Is if they don't know what the thematic issue is, it's really hard for somebody to see a bulleted list of 15 things they're doing wrong and not feel like they just want to cry themselves to sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're just like, oh, especially when you come back to that idea of 3, right? Sometimes we need to chunk things to get to that 3. Like if you're giving the feedback as well, you can't give 15 different tiny things. Like that person is going to feel completely kicked to death. It's just impossible for them to understand it as well. So it goes both ways.
Absolutely. And that's the point that I want to make is whether you are trying to get off of a performance plan, in which case you need those 3 main steps and you need very clear goals, or you are delivering one, if it's not clear to the end employee what they need to do, you're both going to be set up for failure.
Yeah.
Not everybody is coachable. I have fired people. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I've done it.
Yeah.
And it's hard because I like to think pretty good boss. I'm giving thematic feedback. I'm giving clear examples, clear expectations. And I have had one person who I fired that in the meeting went, yeah, actually that makes sense. You're right. I didn't do those things we talked about. And I was like, self-aware king. Yes. Thank you.
Self-aware, obstinate king. Here we go.
Exactly. But I think that it is important to set those clear expectations if you are a leader. Not everybody will be coachable. And I think the frustration that happens is if you are ADHD or even neurotypical and you get a list of 15 things wrong with you, you're never going to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no way for you to fix 52 nitpicky items in a way that's going to be constructive.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Give us something to hyper focus on. Meeting preparation. I'll look at all the things. And I will say, and this goes for employees and employers, consider the fact that you might have to learn a few new skills. I think that's something that is really important. Like if you need to come to coaching, whatever kind of coaching it is, for some information on how to organize or how to figure out how to do meetings, how to do presentations, like chances are you're going to have to learn something. It's not necessarily just a personality thing that you now have to like change. I think sometimes people feel like it all has to be done internally, but just consider it like, it's really, really difficult to do, but maybe after a few drinks, consider it a learning exercise, a chance to learn a new skill, because that's sometimes what that's about, really.
Yeah. And I've never seen anyone that I've coached or that I've worked with who it was a personality issue the reason why they were not successful. The reason they were not successful is because they were not open to feedback and they were not open to learning new things. Yeah. And I've coached clients before. I'm a pretty candid person. I try to be as kind as possible, but also candid in my coaching. And I've had clients where I've asked point blank, like, hey, why are you paying me? Because like you've made it very clear that you don't want to follow my advice, which is fine. That's your prerogative.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a lot of money to not be doing the things we're talking about. Yeah. And I had a client once tell me like, oh, I just can't keep complaining to my wife about it. And I was like, oh, great. Sure. Feel free to pay me for that then. Yeah. Now I know that you're not actually looking to get better. You just want somebody to vent to. That's great. Yeah. Let's do it. But I do think that like you have to your point, be open to learning new things. Like being told that nobody liked me was hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it taught me to connect with people better. It taught me to deliver non-aligned thoughts in a way that was more palatable to the people I was working with. It taught me to collaborate more effectively because I had to learn to communicate the things I needed to communicate in a way that was received better by other people. It wasn't a personality thing. It wasn't being inauthentic or fake. I get that a lot. Like, oh, well, to survive in the neurotypical workplace, I just have to be fake. I just have to pretend like everything's okay, and I have to be super nice and smile.
The eccentric, amazing person that we know you are. I'm always like, lean in.
I'm like, be who you are.
Yeah.
Do it in a way that's effective. If you're going to be eccentric, do it on purpose. Don't do it on accident. Because we've all worked with somebody who they're talking to us and we're like, do they know that they're a jerk? Do they know at all? Have they? And they don't. For the record.
Yeah.
I know because at some point they end up in my coaching and they're like, really? That was perceived poorly? And you're like, yeah.
Yeah.
And so as long as you're being intentional with it, like you can improve any skill. Now, that doesn't mean that the job that puts you on a performance plan is the best fit job for you. There are other jobs that might be a better fit job for you. But
I will say, sorry, I just want to say this because I get this all the time. Consider that you don't necessarily need to immediately quit your job, because I work with so many people who are like, I got told that I wasn't the best, and so I thought maybe I should quit my job. And it's like, whoa. Let's just check what the problem is first. Let's just see if we can solve it and then make a considered decision, not an impulsive jump. That's what we want to do. That doesn't look good on your CV. I see it all the time when we're working in the workplace.
Absolutely, Sky. And just to build on that, if you have a skill deficit in your current role, changing jobs is just going to carry that skill deficit with you. Especially if it's something more in the soft skills range, like communication, organization, meeting structure, executive presence, those types of skills that are applicable to literally any job. If you have a deficit in that space, just quitting your job is not going to magically make you great at that thing in a new environment. You have to improve those skills. So I always tell my clients, we're going to do this in parallel. We can figure out what the right best job is for you while we're building the skills you need to be successful in that job. And then you could make a shift, but it doesn't always mean quit immediately. Now, exceptions to this are like super toxic corporate culture and super toxic bosses. Sometimes we just need to quit for our mental health and safety. But I totally agree with you, Sky. The answer is not always quitting the job. I would say it's probably 10 to 15% of the time do the clients who come to me ultimately actually end up quitting their jobs.
Same.
More
actually,
often, it's, hey, I had this skill deficit. When I fixed it, everything else got better. And now I can progress within my current company in a way that was holding me back.
Yeah, no, 100%. Cool. Well, I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to ask you the questions we ask everyone. So my question is just, let's say someone's been listening to this, and thank you for listening. This is one longer episodes, but I think it's so good. Like, the information is so good. What if someone wants to dip their toe into playing the corporate game, in inverted commas? Like, what advice do you have for somebody who's like, okay, I've just been showing up to work, but I'm ready to kind of like really lean in? Like, what does that look like?
Yep. So the two biggest things when it comes to playing the corporate game is, one, relationships and networking. Most people think that the buck stops with their boss. Like, my boss has to like me, my boss has to appreciate my work, and then I'll get promoted, I'll progress my career, I'll get more opportunities, yada, yada. The reality is that your boss at some points go into a room with a bunch of other leaders and they talk about you. And if nobody else in that room knows who you are, you're going to get stuck. It's just the reality. I have worked for companies that literally heat map people. Kendall, do we know her? Red means no, not at all. Yellow means maybe a little. Green means yes, and they're a superstar. I have literally seen heat maps of like, how well do we know these people? And if you're not green across the board, you're not getting promoted. So it's not saying that that's the way corporate should work. But the reality is, the more people you know, you have good relationships with, you understand, the more successful you're going to be. So especially for ADHD people, for me, I'm an introvert, contrary to popular opinion. I don't love sitting in a meeting, chatting with people if I don't have to, unless it's something fun like this. But if you're going to network and it feels uncomfortable for you, come prepared with questions. We feel a lot of pressure in networking. Like, we have to talk. We have to like add all this value. The reality is that people love to hear themselves talk. So come with 3 to 5 great questions, run through those. When time runs out, say, thank you so much for, taking time to chat with me. I'd love to meet with you again in 3 months if you're open to it, and set some very comfortable structure there. So ask questions like, tell me about yourself and your background. What are your biggest priorities in 2025? What types of projects are you and the team working on? Is there anything that I should be doing to better support you? Let them lead. They'll ask you things in return and you can respond, but come in with those questions. So networking, relationship building is the first biggest piece to playing the corporate game, because in the end, conversations about progression happen in rooms you are not present. So how many people can you get in that room who say, yes, Kendall deserves to be promoted? The more people in that room who think that, the better off. So relationships and networking. And the second piece is having an understanding of what other people care about, especially if you're ADHD and you hyperfixate. I'm not saying we all do this, but I'm a numbers person. I can tell you to the penny in the end, in an analysis that I've run, exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means we should do next. And I could justify that to the moon. But when we go to present to leaders, generally they don't care, honestly. They want to know that you know what you're doing, but they don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily care that you rounded from 0.3 to 0 because that's not really relevant to them. But how do you understand what's important to them and put what's important to you in those terms, right? So
Yeah.
I'll give some easy examples. You're presenting to somebody in finance. How does this cut costs, reduce costs, keep us on budget, drive efficiency, or spend money? That's all
Mm-hmm.
they care about. So
Mm-hmm.
when you go to present to them, say, hey, to set the stage for the meeting, I know it's really important to you guys that we stay on budget this year. I've identified an opportunity that could drive some efficiency in our teams that would allow us to save some money on people, which would keep us on budget. Here's the problem that I'm solving. Here's what I'd recommend we do.
Yeah.
Here's how much it saves us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
if you can build relationships and network, and then you can take the work you care about and put it in terms of the work other people care about,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
those two pieces are going to make you far more successful.
Yeah.
They're going to help you progress your career more. And neither one of them require you to be inauthentic to who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Neither one of them require you to fake it till you make it or show up and sell them a used car in a really classy
Mm-hmm.
way. Like, you can show up exactly how you are. You can build relationships with people who you really like, who have power and influence and authority, and you can get the things you want to get done
Yeah.
because they care about it, because we put
Yeah.
it in terms of what was
Mm-hmm.
important to them. So those would be the two biggest pieces if you want to start to play the game, is figure those two things out. Almost everything comes back to those two.
Yeah. And that's brilliant advice, not just for the corporate game, but also if you wanted to get into business. You know, I coach a lot of people in business and business development, and it's very similar. So these are just really great strategies for working with people in general. Okay, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. So the first one is, what is a professional achievement that you are the most proud of?
So I recently finished writing my book, Secrets of the Career Game, 36 Strategies to Get Ahead in Your Career. I'm very excited. But it has literally been a dream of mine to write a book since I was 7. I still have the stapled paper books I drew my mom that I wrote stories on. And I always thought I would write a fiction book. And then life has led me on this path where I got a publishing deal for this nonfiction book. So for me, I would say, as far as professional accomplishments, to me, even if I never sold a copy, which if you want a copy, you should buy one. But if I never sold a copy, I would be thrilled that
That's
that
amazing.
had happened. So for me, that is my biggest accomplishment. Also because it forced me to distill the thoughts that I share on these podcasts, that I share on social media, that I share with my clients, into something that I think is generally actionable for every single person on the planet, regardless of whether or not you can afford or are inclined towards coaching.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that. And what about a professional failure that's embarrassed you, and how did you deal with that?
So to learn to play the corporate game, generally you do it wrong first. So I would say there was a stage in my career where I worked on a very high profile project. I was working with CEO of the firm, lots of managing directors. It was this very big project. And I was almost like the golden child in it. We were running all of these analysis, doing all these cool things. It was really great. And as an ADHDer, I get a lot of joy from recognition, verbally and otherwise. So I'm living my high life. Everything is going great. And I had a frustration, and I confided in somebody that I worked with who I thought was a good friend of mine. And very quickly found myself being left out of meetings.
Oh no.
My work was being taken and given to other teams. All of a sudden, this executive group that really loved me, nobody's responding to my emails. And it was a really important lesson to me that who you surround yourself with and the things you talk about becomes so important at work, because it was my mistake for confiding in somebody that I had this frustration that I worked with. It's a very hard learned lesson. But it also taught me that if you don't have a really big, really powerful safety net, it doesn't matter how great you are at your job. You can find yourself on the outside really, really quickly. And so it was embarrassing for me because I felt like I had such a good reputation. I'd done all this work. I was working really hard. But, the traditional things everybody says, but my work is so good. And I'm working so hard and I'm doing all these things. And then I learned very quickly that when the people decided that I was not their people, that was the end of the line. And so it was a really painful lesson for me at the moment. It was really embarrassing to admit, but I look back on it and I'm very thankful, because without it, I would have never become a coach. I would have never had the skills to navigate these types of situations. I would have never known how important it was to network with the upper execs. And that taught me all the things that now are in my book and on my podcast. Obviously, it's not a solo experience, but as far as like the most embarrassing, that would be it.
Wow. Well, that's a great answer to that question. And I'm glad that you've able to turn that into the positives because, I feel that. And then my last question for you is, if you had an ADHD life motto, what would it be?
Ooh, rule of threes. Honestly. So I teach the rule of threes to everybody who works with me. The rule of threes applies to communication. Don't communicate more than 3 points. It applies to getting something bought into by senior leadership. Never give more than 3 options. It is, I never have more than 3 goals in a day, in a week, in a month, and a year. It is literally the rule of threes is how I have organized my life. And it's funny, as one last side note, when I wrote my book, I wasn't thinking about it, but I'm writing this book and my publisher calls me and goes, hey, so your book has officially like 36 secrets in it over 12 chapters. So there's 3 secrets in every chapter. And I was like, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me. I didn't realize I was doing that. But yes. And he was like, cool. I just want to make sure that was on purpose because it's like very even. And I've never seen that happen before. And I was like, surprise. My whole brain works in threes. So
that's so interesting.
That would be my ADHD motto because more than 3, you've lost me. And now I'm off thinking about knitting and you can't bring me back.
Actually, I think I have some research to back that up. So with ADHD, with working memory, usually people say 5 to 7. 5 to 7 is kind of a working memory thing. ADHD, we struggle with working memory. So 3 makes sense. So there you go.
And it's interesting because I've worked for consulting firms and large tech companies, and that's what they teach their employees is never more than 3 because there's this weird balance point where like less than 3, we feel like something is incomplete. More than 3, we struggle to retain it long term or to focus on it. So yes, rule of threes would be my ADHD life motto.
I love that. I love that. Well, thank you so much, Kendall, for taking the time to share your story, to share your skills. Gosh, everybody, you need to save this episode with us today. Where can people find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, so I am that career coach pretty much everywhere. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, not Twitter because somebody stole it. It's fine. And thatcareercoach.net. So if you want any information about me, that is where. And then also I will send for the show notes a link to our book pre-sales. If you pre-order, you get access to a private Q&A with me as well.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so exciting. Well, thank you so much, Kendall. And I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you, Sky.
Thank you for listening, everyone. And a big thank you to Adam for making us sound great and Anastasia for making us look great. We couldn't do it without you.
And if you're looking for any of the references to the papers that we discuss, head on over to our show notes page because I always bring the receipts.
Plus, if you want to find out more about us or any more deep diving into what we're doing, you can find us on Substack. That's where the community is. That's where we're chatting. And you can see all of the fun and exciting things that we are bringing to the table.
Thanks for being here.